This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest, Monte A. Melnick, author of On the Road with the Ramones. From the first show right up through to the band's very last gig in 1996, Monte A. Melnick was the Ramones tour manager. 20 years, over 2,000 shows. He spent every single day of his life with the Ramones. In fact, he's often been called the fifth Ramone, and for good reason. In 2003, he, along with author Frank Meyer, released the book On the Road with the Ramones. The book is a must-read for any Ramones fan and fan of rock and roll. On the Road is an oral history of the Ramones' legacy and features unfiltered commentary from friends, acquaintances, crew, musicians, and the band itself. As one reviewer wrote on Amazon, it's a superior biography of a classic band. With us to share his stories of life on the road with the Ramones is Monte A. Melnick. And we talked on what was Joey Ramone's 70th birthday. To hear the songs we discuss in this interview, check out the show notes page. Monte, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
That's a pleasure to be here. Just one little correction. The fifth Ramone's a little misleading because actually the fifth Ramone is Marky. And then it goes Richie, CJ, even Elvis. Maybe the eighth or ninth Ramone, maybe along with Arturo and other people that work with the band, you know?
Yeah. Well, your story with the Ramones begins back in your junior high school days. That's where you met the guys, right?
Well, Tommy Ramone was a good friend back there. I went to junior high school with Tommy and high school with Tommy and worked with him in performance studios and then with the Ramones.
Can you tell us about what you recall of those days, your first impressions of each of the guys?
Well, I grew up with Tommy, and I was in the bands with Tommy before the Ramones, a couple of bands, one called Triad, a three-piece group, and one called Butch, after the glam rock type of, before punk rock stuff. So then I was working with Tommy. We had a rehearsal recording studio called Performance Studios on 23 East 20th Street, and that's where I saw the rest of the band. When he brought them in, he was just going to produce them and manage them. So I saw Johnny, Joey, and at that time at the Performance Studios, and I worked with them there, working sound for them in the studio there.
Dee Dee was the band's lead singer at first, or was that the intent?
Yeah, Tommy brought them in as a three-piece, and Joey was on drums, and Dee Dee was singing and playing bass, but they was very, 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 very raw in the beginning, early years, and Dee Dee was having trouble playing bass and singing, but Tommy heard that Joey had a great voice, and he pulled Joey up the drums, and he became the lead singer, but they couldn't find at that time they were so raw, no drummer could understand what they were doing. And Tommy, being a great musician, kind of sat down on the drums. He was a guitar player, not a drummer, and kind of tried to show drummers, play like this, but no drummer could understand what they were doing, so he joined the group at the time. Initially, he just wanted to manage them and produce them and engineer them, but then he joined the group.
And at this point, do the guys have a mission in mind? Do they know the sound that they're looking for, the look, the image, all of that, or does that just come over time? Well,
initially, if you see some of the early shots of the Ramones at Cbgb's, they were coming from the glam rock era. It was like transitioning into punk music. Well, it wasn't punk at the time, but it was more rock and roll. So initially they decided it was too expensive because Johnny needs one shot. Johnny's wearing like silk pants and a leopard shirt or something like that. And it was expensive, all those clothes. So they figured out, well, just wear what they wear in the streets. That's how they came up with the idea of just wearing jeans and leather jackets. So that developed quickly in the beginning.
And the story behind the band members adopting that last name, Ramone, that came from Dee Dee, whose real name was Douglas Colvin, right?
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
And this was inspired by Paul McCartney?
Yeah, Dee Dee saw that Paul was checking into hotels under Paul Ramone, not his real name, so just to avoid hassles of fans, Dee Dee said, "Hey, Ramone, well, let's call ourselves Ramones." They decided, okay, well, we'll pick up the last name Ramone. And Joey changed his name from Jeff Hyman to Joey Ramone, and Johnny was okay, and Dee Dee was fine with, last name. And Tommy did that kind of rhymes, so that was okay.
And Dee Dee would forever become part of the signature Ramones sound, even though he's not going to be the lead singer. He's the guy that's shouting out the 1, 2, 3, 4 before each song.
Yeah, counting it off, make sure they can do a fast pace,
In Chapter 6 of On the Road, you talk about the job of the tour manager of the Ramones. There's a lot more to the job than most would think, right? I mean, what does the job as Ramones tour manager entail?
Well, first of all, I worked my way up. I first started doing sound for them in a studio when they were doing showcases. Then they started getting jobs at Cbgb's, and I went along with them and started running sound. And they eventually, the studio that we were working in had closed down. And they started getting jobs. So I kind of jumped ship and started doing everything in the beginning. Shopping equipment, driving, and doing sound for them, and everything in the beginning. Mickey Lee is also working with me, Joey's brother. And the bigger they got, the more people we could hire. So we hired like professional sound men and monitor men and drum roadies, guitar roadies. So I worked my way up to road manager, tour manager. Initially, a road manager, tour manager does a lot of different things. I mean, it's a vast, different job. That's why I point out in my book different things that you have to do. You don't have to deal with a crazy band. They have to deal with a crazy crew on top of that. So it's still the amount of nutty people around you.
Oh, I'm sure. Can you talk about the shows that the Ramones played at Cbgb, the legendary Cbgb, those early shows?
They played CBGB about 60 times. I was there for most of them. But I mean, there is a video, a black and white video of them. You can see they were starting and stopping and fighting and arguing and stuff. It was very raw in the beginning. They had to really work on their act for a year or so, And the only people basically at CB's in those days was just other band members, so they could work it out easily without a large audience in front of them, So if you go to YouTube and just put in the early Ramones show, you can see exactly how raw they were and what they were up against and how they were operated in the beginning. Yeah, as I said, the only people basically in the clubs in the beginning watching was other band members. That's how they got to know a lot of the bands from the early days at CBGB's. They were just hanging out.
Do you have a favorite CBGB story? I'm sure you saw some crazy stuff going on there, and Ramones played so many shows. I think, 75 just by the end of 1974, at least if that's correct. I think I read that online somewhere.
Yeah, they played a lot of shows there. It was a rough job in there because it was a small club, small stage. The backstage was non-existent. The bathrooms are horrible, but they worked out their chops there, which was good. I was working sound there. We're just getting my own things together because Tommy showed me he was before he was working with the Ramones, he was a sound engineer, assistant sound engineer at the record plant. I think he worked with Jimi Hendrix a little bit and stuff. So he knew a lot about sound, and so he showed me how to work the soundboards and stuff. That's how I got to work the soundboards for them. And initially, the first bunch of shows, I was a sound man until they decided to hire a professional sound man.
It's got to add to the vibe of the performance, though, just that gritty atmosphere. I mean, those clubs, there's a certain energy in those rooms that you're not going to get in the fancy venues. Did those guys enjoy playing at CBGB's?
Well, initially, after playing like 60, 70 times there, they worked their act there, so it's good for them. They fit in there very well, and they developed there. So, eventually they wanted to get out of there and play bigger, better venues, so they're happy to expand out.
And they sure did expand. Chapter 8, titled, Hey Ho, Let's Go, Frank Meyer's intro. Like every band, the Ramones like to have fun on the road and got into many wild misadventures and hijinks along the way. Lots of drugs, booze, and practical jokes. What would you say is the craziest Ramones on the road story regarding practical jokes?
Well, here's the thing. They decided to do the practical jokes on me instead of themselves. So if they were doing it on themselves, they would probably get pissed off at each other, So I got drawn to them, There's stupid little high school pranks, They put honey on my briefcase when I pick it up, or honey on the van door when I touch the door, or some stupid thing like that, or the bucket of water on the doorway, Frank, and all that stuff. So that's part of being a tour manager, road manager. You got to take what the band gives and not worry about it, because it's better you get it and then fighting with each other because, hey, you did this, why'd you do that,
Sure, if it keeps them together to play pranks on you, so be it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. You say in the book, Marky never knew what city he was in. We'd be in Cleveland and we'll tell him it was Detroit and he'd never know the difference. Either he was out of it or didn't care. So I'm curious as to what did you and the band think of the movie Spinal Tap, which of course includes that famous Hello Cleveland scene?
It was great. Them getting lost down and underneath, trying to find a stage. That was true. I think that happened once in the band. We were in some large venue and we couldn't find a stage. So that's kind of like a true thing. I love that movie. The funny thing about it is, all the drummers explode in the Spinal Tap, but the Ramones went through the drummers.
Sure.
You know,
they went through how many? 4? How many drummers in all?
Well, Tommy, Richie, Elvis. 3.
Yeah, okay.
4, Marky.
Okay. 4 with Marky. We'll get to the change in drummers a little bit more. Was the band getting along okay in the early days, or did you see some of the tensions building between the band members early on?
No, early. They were friends. They grew up together. They went to high school together, so they knew each other, and they decided to form the group together, and they wrote the songs together in the beginning. They were, if you notice, all the first couple albums, they all have Ramones listed as of songwriting. Later on, when they decided to make sure they all got credit for different songs they wrote, so that happened. And, of course, the Linda, Johnny, Joey thing happened, and so that put a little tension on. But, basically they were friends at the beginning.
Yeah, you're talking about that love triangle. Joey discovered that his girlfriend, Linda, had fallen in love with his bandmate, Johnny.
Yeah.
It's pretty much what all bands eventually have to deal with as they get bigger. There's like you said, the songwriting credit, publishing, creative decisions, and then the love triangle stuff. All that stuff can happen. So it really was nothing more or different than your average band that goes through all of that stuff, especially if they're together for as long as they were.
True.
The band's 1976 self-titled debut, huge hit with the critics. Robert Christgau of The Village Voice wrote, "I love this record. Even though I know these boys flirt with images of brutality, for me it blows everything else off the radio." Did the guys react to those kinds of reviews? Did they carry the way? Was that important to them?
Well, they like good reviews, but there was I think Sire put out an ad about putting the good reviews and the bad reviews, like the good ones, and then there's other reviews. This group is horrible. It's just a bunch of noise. And they put this out as an ad, the good reviews and the bad reviews, to kind of contrast. They didn't really care about it, really. I mean, they liked when it was a good review,
Despite those reviews, the album wasn't a huge commercial success. Those days, I'm guessing, financially tough. I mean, what do you recall about those days as far as just trying to survive day to day financially?
Well, it wasn't a huge success, and I think it just went gold a couple of years ago, after like 40 years. So that's pretty crazy. Basically, they decided that they couldn't sell albums because the U.S. radio wasn't playing them, so they decided to just tour, and that's the meat and potatoes, touring and merchandise. So that's how they survived, basically. And
what did they travel around in just the van, or what?
With all different vehicles, station wagons, van with a trailer. We had buses also. Eventually, later on in the States, we decided to do small area tours, like to the East Coast for 2 weeks in a van. Because buses are very expensive, and they didn't like sleeping on the buses. They liked to have a hotel room. So later on, we did do buses, but we didn't sleep on them, so it was getting very expensive at the time, because they like to stay at hotels also. So they decided in the States to do like sections. They do East Coast for 2 weeks, come back in a van, and then they maybe do the West Coast. They'd fly out there. The crew would drive the van out there. We'd do a couple of weeks up and down the West Coast, then come back, take a week or two off, and then the Midwest again in a van. So they found the van was very good for them because they could get around easily and stay at hotels on top of that. As long as they kept the tours like 2 or 3 weeks, and come back and go out again in a week or two. So that's the way they developed the van tour.
Were they writing music on the van?
Not in the van, no. In their hotel rooms, they were probably writing stuff and doing things and stuff. Not in the van. They usually just, in those days, they had Walkmans and listening to transistor radios and stuff, and pretty quiet.
What were the interests the guys had as far as that? You talk about having the Walkman on. What kind of music? I know Joey liked the Beatles, Beach Boys. What were the backgrounds with those guys musically? What were the bands they followed?
Oh, everything. Tommy and I grew up with this Fillmore East here, so we saw everybody. I saw Jimi Hendrix and Who, and Fillmore East had fantastic shows, Sam and Dave and all sorts. So they liked all sorts of music. And, there was a lot of clubs on the island we'd go to and see different bands play, the Vagrants and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Vagrants was Leslie West band. Remember Mountain, Leslie West?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Sadly, he just passed.
Yeah, that's true. He was a Queens boy. They listened to everything. Johnny liked the Stones and the Beatles. Actually, he liked the Stones better because there's a famous, in my book, I write, Tommy and Johnny went to see the Beatles at Shea Stadium, and Johnny brought a bunch of rocks to throw at them. At the time, he didn't like the Beatles. Later on, he liked the Beatles, and Tommy liked the Beatles. They'd listen to all sorts of music, and the radios back then, was pretty good, good music back then. So they had a vast array of music they listened to, they were exposed to.
Yeah, and that was the time, you talk mid to late 70s, New York, you're right in that time period where, what a great time. I mean, of course, we had disco, but that punk scene was emerging, and the Ramones were right there at the forefront. And New York in the 70s, how do you best describe that to anyone who didn't live in the city during those days? What was it like?
It was pretty crazy. Luckily, we were touring a lot, so we weren't exposed to a lot of this stuff, But, Cbgb was in the middle of the Bowery, and the Bowery in the Lower East Side was a horrible place at the time. It was like, run down buildings, junkies, Bowery missions, bums running around the place. The city was run down at the time, so it was a challenge. But luckily, we toured a lot, so we missed a lot of the crappy stuff in the city.
Toys in the Attic, Aerosmith, I remember Jack Douglas, the producer, talking about they recorded a lot of that in an area that was really dangerous. I mean, if they went out just for a walk, they'd have to pack a pistol just in case. There was some crazy stuff going down there in the city.
CBGB was on the Bowery, then you had the Alphabet City, ABC streets there, first, second. You didn't want to go in that area. You didn't want to stay closer to Bowery, 3rd Avenue and all that. So, but there's still, a lot of bums, and wasn't a nice area. Now it's all so changed now. It's all like yuppified.
Much different. 1977's Rocket to Russia. That was the first big album, hit number 49. Sheena is a Rocker. That was their first Hot 100 single, reaches 81. Rockaway Beach, number 66. Then they released the live double album, It's Alive, in April of 1979. That's recorded at the Rainbow Theatre in London, New Year's Eve 1977. What do you remember about that show?
Yeah, well, that's good. I was doing the sound for that. I was the soundboard and the audience doing the sound for that. So that was one of the best shows. I mean, they were right on there. I mean, it's a terrific show. They captured that really well, and that's particular, the early Ramones, that's the best show I think they've done.
Tommy Ramone, the first to leave the band, kind of, right? He continues as their producer, but he'd grown tired of touring by this time. Was that something you saw coming, or was it a surprise?
Well, yeah, as I said, he really initially didn't want to be in a band. He just wanted to produce them and manage them. And he's a guitar player, but he's a great musician. So he actually developed that Ramon style on the drums, which Marky came in, and Marky had to learn from Tommy that particular style. I mean, Marky was a great drummer. He came from Dust and all the Voidoids and big groups like that. So, yeah, Tommy didn't. It was rough on Tommy's touring. He didn't like touring really a lot. So, he left. He produced them and stuff, and stayed with them. So, producing, which is great, and that's what he really wanted to do.
There's a side to life on the road that's not glamorous. It can get pretty rough out there, and it can wear you down.
No, you got to be used to it. You got to really get used to what's going on out there. The crappy hotels, and initially in the early years, they weren't making a lot of money, so we were staying in great places, hotels, and of course, as the venues they were playing, the small crappy clubs, which is difficult, bad dressing rooms and all that. So I mean, they went through that. I mean, they were younger, so it was okay. But Tommy initially really didn't want to be touring that much. It was hard on him. Plus he smoked, and they wouldn't let him smoke in the van. It was a no-smoking van, which is great. I hate smoking too. It was rough, and it's a grind. You got to really get used to what goes on. Getting up, traveling 100 miles, a couple hundred miles, sound check, playing, going to bed, get out of there. Next day, travel another couple hundred miles.
Yeah, I mean,
lousy dressing rooms, small clubs, stuff like that. You work your way up.
Sure.
You got to be used to it. And he was there for a few years, and then he decided that was enough, and then transitioned into producing them, which was really what he wanted to do.
Did the guys like to party a lot? I mean, there's the famous Ozzy Osbourne stories where he'd wander off and you didn't know where he went to, and he'd come back 2 days later. I mean, did you have stories like that where you get worried, like, hey, where is he? What the hell happened?
Yeah, well, Dee Dee was a problem, basically. I mean, he was a problem with his drugs and stuff, so I had to really keep an eye on him, and he'd just disappear hopefully he would come back early, enough to do the next day. The rest of the band, Johnny was a trooper. He knew what was going on. Joey was, he liked to party, but he understood on the road you had to pace yourself. I mean, they wouldn't last it this long. I mean, Johnny and Joey, if they partied a heck of a lot,
It's hard. I mean, you're on the road all the time. A lot of those guys probably, hey, getting bored, feeling a little lonely, got to go out, have a few beers, and then next thing you know, hey, the party's happening, and it's a challenge,
there's
I'm
people
sure.
Around you. There's always people around you with drugs and stuff, and they want to friend you with all sorts of stuff, and come on, party, let's have a good time after the show, blah, blah, blah. I mean, they had their share of it, but not a lot. They understood that they had to really keep it under control, and I kept an eye on them, too. Dee Dee was a problem. I tried to rope them in,
So they all seemed pretty focused on the Ramones. The band was the main focus throughout.
Johnny was like the general. He kept them pretty much under his thumb, basically,
You talk about Joey's OCD problems. When did you first start to think that something was up with Joey, and how did the band react to that?
Well, initially, in the early years, nobody knew what it was. It wasn't a diagnosed illness, so nobody knew what was going on. We thought he was like out of his mind and stopped doing that, Eventually, they did diagnose it, and he got some medicine later on, but it was rough. It was very hard, especially to me. Getting him in and out of hotels, the airplanes and trucks. I mean, to the van, out of the van, and crossing streets. It was rough. It was rough.
I believe there's a story in the book. I know Frank was telling me you got off an airplane and you just came from a whole another city, and Joey said, we got to go back.
Yeah, we got off at JFK and I drove him back to his house on 9th Street, and then he said, oh, I got to touch something back at the airport.
Man.
I said, fine. You can't take a cab. He took a cab back to the airport, touched something, came back. That's how bad it was. Eventually, later on, I mean, he did get some medicine to take, made it a little better, but it still was, a problem.
I think he connected with Howard Stern on that level because I think Howard had the same issue. And I think those guys were buddies, right? Howard and Joey, they connected.
Yeah, they did. They kind of looked alike. So
Right.
Howard, oh, well, you look like me. I look like Joey, said, well, you look like me. And they liked each other. I mean, Howard's a fan. Although he did, with some of his interviews, he tried to instigate fights between Joey and Marky, that was his program to make sure things going crazy,
Want to get to the band appearing in the film Rock and Roll High School, and they work with Phil Spector on the End of the Century album, and then there's that story that Spector held Johnny at gunpoint, and he made the band watch a horror film about...
It wasn't Johnny. It wasn't Johnny.
It wasn't Johnny. Okay.
So he didn't... He had guns on him, right? And he would wave them around, and there was a point we went up to his house. And his house, you had to get unlocked to get in and unlocked to get out. You couldn't just walk out the door. So he kept us there a couple of times watching a movie, like crazy horror movies. He was very difficult to work with. And he had bodyguards, and they had guns. And he just waved the gun around. He never really did much with it, If you look at my book, in 1977, there's a picture of Phil Spector came to the Whiskey A Go-Go. He really liked them back then. And he came to the show and came backstage. There's a picture of him in my book there. He was a fan. He liked them. And eventually, Seymour Stein got in touch with him later on to do the album. Eventually, we worked with him because he wanted to work with the band. That's amazing. Phil liked Joe because of his voice, and he sang kind of reminded of Ronnie Spector a little bit. And actually, Joey did work with Ronnie Spector later on. I actually worked with Ronnie Spector later after the Ramones. I did a couple of tour managing things for her.
Cool.
It was great working with her. But Ronnie Spector and Joey became very good friends.
So were you around for a lot of that End of the Century recording?
I was there. I was in the studio. Phil wouldn't let you in the actual studio a lot, but I was there. I brought them to the studio. I brought the crew there. I made sure the equipment was there. I was there for all the shows. And there was a couple of scenes where he's confrontational to me, There was one time that they were fed up. They wanted to leave, and I'm walking out the door, and Phil comes to me and give me the keys. You can't leave now. He's shouting and yelling at me, And,
yeah, I mean, how did you handle that? Did you get back into his face, or did you just say, all right, fine, I'm walking?
Well, no, he said, we're leaving, Phil. No, I'm not going to give you the keys and stuff like that. He was just, he tried to bully. But it didn't work. Because, they all wanted to leave, so we left.
Yeah.
For that particular day. The problem was Phil worked very slowly. He worked slow. The Ramones worked fast. They wanted to do things fast. photo session was fast. So they would go through recording sessions fast, and he would work slow. So it was driving them nuts, you know. They said, Phil Spector, great, let's work on him because he's a production genius and stuff. They were happy to do it. But then working with him in the studio became a very taxing.
He had one of the guys do a riff like over and over and over again.
Yeah, I think Rock and Roll High School or something.
Yeah, Rock and Roll High School. Just have him do it over and over and over. That's crazy.
Yeah, that drove Johnny crazy.
Chapter 11, you talk a little bit about radio airplay or the lack of radio airplay. You say for a long time, we busted our asses to get to each and every radio interview the label would set up for us. We run between sound check and the gig and back to be on any show that would have us, yet we never got added to the playlist, never seemed to get anything out of it. Later on, the band became less enthusiastic about doing the interviews. Why bother? Radio never really embraced the Ramones. Why do you think that is?
Well, you know, the Sex Pistols did hurt the Ramones, basically, because they would go out and do stupid things at radio stations and TV shows and idiotic, and then, you know, the whole attitude of anarchy and all that. So the radio stations lumped the Ramones in with them, you know?
Because they're just great songs, man. They're great tunes. I mean,
yeah,
they're made for the radio. 2-3 minute jams.
But the U.S. radio wouldn't play them.
Yeah.
It was a shame. As I said, because the U.S. stations wouldn't play it. Overseas, they'd play more of the Ramones, and in fact, down in South America, they were huge down there because they got a lot of radio play.
Chapter 13 of On the Road, titled We're a Happy Family, with a question mark. The early 80s, the lineup starts to go through changes. Markey fired in 83 due to alcoholism. Frank Meyer had an interesting comment during our interview. He said, no matter how bad the fights got within the band, they all loved you, and you maintain a great relationship with all of them. How were you able to pull that off? Because I would think it's easy to get into an awkward position of like, hey, you're taking his side. No, you're not on my side. How do you manage all of that when that's going down?
Well, that's one of the things being a tour manager, road manager. You got to be diplomatic. You got to kind of juggle around and make sure you don't go one side or the other. Unfortunately, there was a little stress because I had to help Joey a lot because of his OCD, you know. So I had to make sure that he would pack all his stuff, his medicine, his right clothes, and you know, and everything was right. So I'd kind of like help him out. Johnny saw that, you're just kind of favoring Joey, but actually, you know, if Joey didn't have the stuff, I'd have to go on the road and get it. You know what I mean? So if you forget something, you know, so I kind of make sure Joey got the right stuff for the trips on the road and stuff like that.
They perceived it as like a prima donna thing, maybe like, he's the lead singer, he's got to get all the attention.
Well, yeah, he didn't understand that Joey, because of his condition, needed a little extra help. That's why I was helping him out. You know what I mean? And then, you know, I was friendly with Johnny, but not as friendly with him as with Joey. You know. Also, at the time, a girlfriend of mine, sister's Angela, who I'd introduced to Joey, so they got together. So we hung out a lot. So Joey's was going with my girlfriend's sister, Angela, and they almost got married, but that's before Linda. And so I was very close to Joey because I'd go over to Joey's house and hang out with his mother, and you know, and because of Angela and stuff, and my girlfriend and stuff like that. So I was a little closer to Joey. And Johnny didn't like that. I mean,
was there ever a time you felt you had enough, wanted out? Was it too crazy for you? Or was this just you love these guys, love the band, and you were going to be there till the end?
No, it was one of the very rare moments where I'd get pissed off and yell at them or something like that. But
yeah,
but I kept it under control. I realized it was more benefit than, you know, just saying goodbye, you know, because there was always something. The beautiful part I had was, you know, most tour road managers, they work with the band comes off tour, and then that was it. They have to find another band or something, you know, before. For me, it was great because they kept me on the whole time because I would do the rehearsals with them, then I'd do the videos with them, and then was working with them in the movie. Of course, I'm in the movie, by the way, you know, I have a little cameo part in the movie, right? You know that, right?
Oh, no, wait, we're talking Rock and Roll High School? You're in that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Briefly. You know, there's a part where they're driving up in coming to the venue in the pink Cadillac, singing, I just want to have something to do.
Yeah.
So they pull up to the curb, and I come out and open the door and walk across. You can see me walk across, and then I'd shake the hands of the manager, I'm kind of like telling the promoter, I'm behind the band. So if you watch that whole song, I'm right behind the band talking to the manager, kind of pointing out things.
Oh, I got to watch it again. I'll look for you.
Watch, you'll see me. As soon as the car pulls up to the curb, you'll see me there. And then there's another little cameo part in the hallway, and the hall monitors are chasing people around the halls, and there's a quick shot of me in there, too. But
tell me about that movie. How was it filming that movie? The guys have a good time filming that?
People don't realize when you make a movie, it's basically a lot of sitting around. They sit around, they set up a shot, they film like 10, 20 minutes, and then they sit around another hour or two to set up another scene. So they didn't like that, I mean, Johnny didn't. I didn't mind just hanging around and talking to people in the crew and stuff like that. But they were kind of antsy because they had to sit around for a couple of hours before the next shot and stuff like that, and get up early, come to the set. I had to drag them to the set early in the morning and stuff like that. But they grooved. I mean, Johnny was a big film buff, so he kind of enjoyed it.
Like you said, they like to do things fast, get in and out, and let's go. Where was it filmed?
There was abandoned Catholic schools. I can't remember exactly where. There's two different schools, abandoned schools they used.
And I heard that the Ramones weren't the first choice to be in the movie. There was another band, right?
Cheap Trick. They wanted Cheap Trick, but they didn't want to do it. And then they wanted somebody else. But they didn't. I think the Ramones were the third choice. But okay. Alan Ockish, great director, what a terrific job he did with the movie, and he decided he's a huge Ramones fan, so he got the right choice on this.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this.
This is Greg Prado, and you're listening to the Booked on Rock podcast with one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, Eric Senich.
We're back with more of the Booked on Rock podcast. Tommy Ramone is quoted in the book as saying Monte was the perfect road manager for this band because they were so psychotic, so he fit right in. He stayed from beginning to end, so obviously he fit perfectly. What do you make of that comment? What's behind that? Were you as psychotic as those guys? Yeah.
He meant that I was the opposite of psychotic.
Okay.
So I fit in.
Okay, gotcha.
So I was psychotic as much as them. They wouldn't have gotten anywhere, let me tell you.
Yeah, you were the sane one in the bunch. Richie Ramone, who took over for Marky on drums, was out in 1987. Clem Burke, a.k.a. Elvis Ramones, in the band. According to Johnny, the performances with Burke were a disaster. He played only 2 shows. What do you recall of those 2 shows in that time with Elvis Ramone?
Well, the problem was Rich quit very abruptly. We were playing on Long Island, and in the club, the dressing room had a door that just led outside. So right after the show in Long Island, he just goes out the back door. There's a limo waiting for him. He left. And we had a bunch of shows set up a week or so later, like the Ritz and stuff like that. So we tried to get him to come back and play, but he wouldn't. So at the time, the manager, Gary Kerfus, was managing Blondie, and they weren't doing anything. They were kind of off or something. Or he also managed B-52s and Talking Heads and stuff like that. So Clem always was a friend, and Clem was always hanging around. As I said, in the Cbgb days, the only people hanging around the club was other bands, and Clem was always hanging around. He was good friends of theirs, and he wanted to be. He said, "I'll do it. I'll join the group."
Yeah.
But the problem was when Tommy left. Tommy's style of drumming was just completely unique. He was a guitar player, but his drumming he perfected for the Ramones. It was a very specific style, So Marky came in, and it took him like a little bit to get the groove. But when Clem came in, he didn't have enough time to rehearse enough. I'm sure if he rehearsed enough with us, he would have gotten it. Gary Kerfus said to him, "No, don't worry, you can play with the Ramones. It's easy." What is it? Easy stuff. Easy. It's not. The Ramones are so tight. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. Boom, 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 boom. If you a teeny little bit out of sync, it's going to throw everything off. It was okay. The shows are all right, but not quite. You can hear it, he didn't have enough time to groove into the proper Ramones set. He played 2 shows, and then Marky came back, so that was good. And of course, Clem made a hell of a lot more money with Blondie. Steve's a great guy, wonderful drummer, terrific person. He really wanted to be into the band. They took publicity pictures with him and stuff like that. But it just didn't work out quite like they had it. He didn't have enough time, to really get into the groove of the Ramones. And luckily, Marky had straightened himself out, was in AA and stuff like that, and he came back. So it was good.
In 1989, C.J. Ramone takes over on bass for Dee Dee, who pursued a career as a rapper. What did you and the guys in the band think of that?
Well, initially, Dee Dee was kind of flaking out. And they said, okay, look, the way you want to do your thing, you do a solo album. Just don't do the Ramones, but do your solo album. That's fine, you know. And so he went off and did his album and stuff, and they let him do that. And then he came back into the Ramones, but he wasn't there quite enough, you know. He was spacing out. He said he wanted to get out of the Ramones army. So eventually he said goodbye, you know. He wanted to be a rapper. And if you listen to the album, it's interesting, to put one word, mildly interesting and funny at the other times, you know. But he really wanted to be a rapper, so they let him do that, and he did it. But, you know, eventually he was just spacing out on stage. He wasn't there. He wasn't there for the shows, and they realized that. So when he finally said, I'm going, they said, all right, well, wow. I thought it was the end of the Ramones at the time, you know, because Dee Dee Ramone, the founding member, one of the greatest writers and stuff for all the songs and stuff. But luckily, they found CJ, who was a young Dee Dee, you know, so they had to suck their stomachs in to keep up with him, and he gave him a whole bunch of more years. And then luckily, Dee Dee decided he was going to still write for the band. So he had the great writing of Dee Dee in the band, and then the great, you know, CJ in there playing like a young Dee Dee, which really helped them.
They went another 7 years. They called it quits in 1996. Yeah, but not before they play at Lollapalooza, summer 96. What stands out the most to you regarding those last shows? Because you're quoted in On the Road talking about how funny was the band using a van.
We were doing sections of the country and just following the tour around. But at that time, we could do the van too. But the crew had a bus because they had to stay there and sleep on the bus and load out and load in early and stuff. So the funny thing about it is we'd pull into these, you know, huge venues, and the bus pulls in and the crew comes out, and the van pulls in and the band comes out. So everybody's laughing at them, you know. That's
great. Take us back to that moment when the Ramones are playing the last song of the last show. I mean, what's going through your mind at that point? You've been with the band since, you know, since you were in your teens, right? Over 2,000 shows, and this is it. Do you remember?
I would say the teens. I was a little later, but
a little bit later,
mid-20s. Yeah, mid-20s. You know, they talked about quitting earlier tours, and I didn't really think they would do it, but it was getting very serious when they decided. You know, Johnny moved out to L.A., and Joey wasn't feeling that great, and so it was sobering. It was a sobering moment when they said, that's it, and then they realized that was going to be the end.
You bummed? Was it sad?
Yeah, it was so, yeah. After like 20-something years working with a band, all of a sudden they stopped, and it was like traumatic.
Was there a moment after the show you guys all got together, or was it just...
No. John left right away. He didn't want to hang out. Joe was hanging out. Lemmy was there. That was great. The great Lemmy. It's a shame he's gone.
Yeah.
And he came on stage and played that song with Ramon that he wrote for the Ramones. What a great song. You're familiar with that song, right?
Yes. Who else was up there on stage? A lot of big names went up there. Was Chris Cornell there?
Right from Rancid.
Or no, it was
he was there.
Eddie Vedder?
Right from Rancid. Tim from Rancid, Eddie Vedder, yeah, Lemmy. And actually Dee Dee came out and sang a song, and he forgot the lyrics and stuff. It was like spaced, you know.
That was cool because that just showed the impact that they had on the generations of bands and artists that came after them. They just huge influence.
Well, yeah, during the Lollapalooza tour, it was like Metallica's headlining and Soundgarden and Rancid and the Ramones. So when the Ramones went on stage earlier, I'm standing there, and all of a sudden all these bands there's Metallica, Soundgarden, Rancid, all on the side of the stage. They're fans, huge, big fans of the Ramones. They became friends with them eventually at the end, but they said when we were kids, we saw you guys, the Ramones there, and they decided to form bands.
That's awesome.
So that's the legacy of the Ramones, I think. A lot of kids saw the Ramones playing and say if they can do it, which they saw the Ramones playing. It wasn't anything unbelievably hard. There wasn't like great solos and stuff like that. It was simple, you know, easy for kids to pick up a guitar and play a Ramones song, and all these bands formed. I mean, U2, Bono, they had that song, The Miracle of Joey Ramone, on one of the albums he writes.
Very good song.
He was a huge Ramones fan. Eddie Vedder gives him credit, and so all these bands, I think that was the legacy of the Ramones, that they went out and played all these clubs in small places all over the place, all over the world. All these kids saw them and said, if they can do it, it's nothing that hard. You have a good song, play competent on your instrument, and they formed groups. So that's the legacy of the Ramones.
And I think any band that gets to that point where things get out of control and they kind of lose their focus and they forget why it is that they started, you look to the Ramones for that. Minimalist, simple, straightforward, raw energy. That's why all of those rock and roll bands started. That's why they wanted to form a band when they were kids. They can lose sight of that. And the Ramones, I don't think ever lost sight of that. I mean, even when the money was coming in and the fame, did you ever see them ever get off focus at any time? Or was it just, were they the same band throughout?
No, they were pretty much focused. I mean, they still, through the whole years, they still had to work hard. But they weren't selling a lot of albums still, As I said, Ed was touring. So they kept focused. They always try to say, well, because all the different albums they all of a sudden decided to try different producers. Maybe this producer, Phil Spector, John Beauvoir, Graham Gouldman, maybe they'll get us a hit,
Yeah.
Play on the radio. It didn't work all the earlier. Now they play it all over the place.
Joey was the most familiar face of the band. How did he handle fame?
Oh, he was great. He always talked to anybody. That's one problem I had with him. We're walking down the street or coming in and out of a venue or something. He'd stop and start talking to somebody for 20 minutes or so. He's just fine. It was fine with him.
You worried about his safety, like some lunatic was going to come up on him, or that he would just take a lot of time hanging?
You just kind of keep an eye out for lunatics, but it never happened. But it was more of getting him back in to going where we're going, so we'd be on time. I'd have to drag him away from that conversation.
He was hard to miss. He just had that look, that iconic look, big, tall, slender, the hair, the shades. You couldn't miss him when he walked into the room.
Yeah, sure. He was noticed, definitely. In fact, in Japan, it was easy to find him in a crowd. He's like a foot and a half over everybody else.
Yeah. He was cool with all the fans that would come up to him.
Yeah. As I said, he talked to anybody for a length of time. I had to drag him away, Johnny was also very friendly to fans, too, but more Joey would just stop and talk,
Yeah. So you tried your hand at managing afterwards, but you didn't like it. What was it that you didn't like about managing?
I don't know. It's a different thing. Dealing with record companies and doing bargains and, I put the band out. Mark and Ramon and Intruders, I got him his first album deal and I think 2 albums, and I put him on the road with another tour manager. But it's different, tour managing and managing with different things. And I worked about a year and a half. We parted amicably, and it was an interesting type of thing to try to do.
Is it basically just like it's going from wearing a T-shirt and jeans to having to wear a suit and sit in an office behind a desk?
I was never a suit guy, but it was a different thing. Yeah, it was more of like in the office, dealing on the phone with record companies and PR people, and not on the road. I like the road better.
Joey battled cancer for a while. He was diagnosed in 1995. Then he lost his battle, sadly, April 15, 2001. Fans were devastated, and I can only imagine how you felt when you heard the news.
Yeah, it was horrible. I mean, I knew he had problems early on because I was, as I said, I would help him pack his medicines and stuff. So he confided in me and told me what was going on earlier, before everybody else knew what was going on, and eventually took over. So it was rough. As I said, it's kind of like family. I'd go with Thanksgiving to his mother's or Christmas and stuff like that, and so I knew him very. It's kind of like family. What
was his family like? His mom and dad?
Oh, his mother was terrific. Charlotte was a great woman, wonderful person.
Proud of her son?
And they were divorced. Oh, yeah. Both of her sons. She's very proud of Mickey, and also, she's passed away, unfortunately, too. Yeah.
What about his dad? Was his dad around?
Well, he had different. His father divorced, and he had stepfathers and stuff like that. So he was closer to. His father Noel. He had on and off a relationship with him, but he liked called him rock pop or something.
The Ramones get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2002. As often the case, there's drama with the past members, who's showing up, who will perform, will there even be a performance? And then the book gets into the tensions that led up to that night. What do you recall about that?
Well, I remember Joey wasn't around. It was a shame he wasn't there for that. And then Johnny didn't want to play. Usually the band inducted plays at the end live, after the show, during the show. He didn't want to play with anybody else. So Green Day came up and played the songs.
Sadly, that was one of Dee Dee's last public appearances. He passed 3 months later of the heroin overdose. You say in the book that it was sadly ironic that he died in Los Angeles, not in New York. What do you remember most about Dee Dee?
Well, initially when he left the band, I figured he would pass away first, because of his drugs. But he kept it together for a long, long time. He had it together, except for the last particular moment there. He said, I'm going to do it one more time, and that was that. Johnny was moved out to L.A., and Dee Dee was living in L.A. Dee Dee was all over the place. He was living in Germany, and he'd hop all over the place. In South America, his last wife was from Argentina. So he'd be floating around all over the place, and he happened to be he had a house in L.A., an apartment. That's where he passed away, unfortunately.
Were the guys okay financially? Did they have...
Yeah, the later years. They were getting a little bit of money, publishing and all that, and making enough money off the road, and merchandising. That was a big thing on the road. They sold a lot of T-shirts and stuff.
Did you get into the trenches with the record companies to do a lot of the battling on that stuff?
No, I mean, that's where they had managers for that. Gary Kurfitz was a very good manager. Danny Fields, Linda Stein managed him very well with that. And I dealt with the record companies as far as doing when we played a venue in a particular city. I deal with the record companies, which is good because they take us out to dinner, and then I'd arrange with the record companies what people they wanted to interview the band and all that stuff. So it was a good relationship with the record companies for me to deal with. I didn't have to hack out any deals or anything.
How about shady characters in those early days playing some of those clubs?
They were lucky because they got some good booking agents. And they didn't want to fool around because I'd say, look, you pay us or you're never going to get another group in here again because of the booking agents. They would book the clubs. There was one time I think we were playing like Oregon, a lumberjack club, and they were playing short sets at the time, like a half an hour. So we come up stage, the guy said, that's not enough. You've got to play more. You got to play more. So they went back on stage and played the set again.
Oh, that's great. What did the guys think of the New York Dolls?
They were they went and saw the Dolls play, and they liked them and stuff,
But while a lot of those bands would also kind of take on that David Johansen thing with a Mick Jagger type persona, they formed their own look and their own image, and that's why they are so iconic right now. There's nobody like the Ramones.
True. Basically decided the look was such, as I said in the early years, it was almost after glam rock, so they were fooling around with a little bit of clothes like that, but they decided, it's too expensive. We'll just wear what we wear in the street, ripped jeans and leather jackets and a T-shirt. And who knew, like, ripped jeans? I mean, I wouldn't walk around with a ripped jean in my youth. I would patch it up or something, But now, people are paying extra money to buy a freaking pair of jeans that are ripped.
I know, isn't that crazy? Yeah, you go to the mall and you got to pay whatever it is, $100 for a pre-ripped jeans. Johnny Ramone passed in 2004. Your thoughts on Johnny?
He was the general, He kept everything pretty much straight and together, and he's very strict and stuff like that.
And they needed that, right?
Yeah, of course. They absolutely needed that.
The remaining surviving members of the Ramones, if I got this right, we got bassist CJ Ramone, drummers Marky Ramone, Richie Ramone, and Elvis Ramone. They're still musically active. Do you keep in touch with those guys today?
Not a lot. The CJ here and there, and not a lot. A little bit.
So you do a lot of appearances? Autograph signing stuff? Do you do those?
Me? No.
No.
Anybody out there? I'm available. Actually, I'm doing something on June 24th at Bar Primi, which is right under the Joey Ramone sign at 2nd Street and Bowery. Myself and Lenny Kay. It's called Stereo Dinner. If you go to stereodinner.com/Monte. And it's a dinner with me and Lenny, and you get a 3-course Italian meal and wine pairing, and you can sit down and talk to us and hash out all the early years of punk and music with myself and Lenny Kay from, Lenny Kay, right?
Yep.
Patti Smith.
Yep, absolutely. You guys got the stories to tell.
If you go to stereodinner.com/Monte, tickets are available. There's only a few available, so get there quickly and see that.
Frank was saying something about items that you may have that are just very valuable now. You got a lot of stuff from those days?
Well, I did, because there was a big show here in Queens, in the Queens Museum, and then went to the Grammy Museum in New York, and I had 170 items of my personal memorabilia in it.
That's what Frank was talking about, the memorabilia.
Yeah, he was in the house. We picked out a lot of stuff for the book in it. And then I had put a lot of stuff in the Queens Museum and went to the Grammy Museum. It was supposed to tour kind of like the Bowie exhibit did, but the people that Ramones production people didn't get along. There's two people that control the Ramones, Linda and Mickey. They wouldn't get along, so they decided not to do the show. So I got all my stuff back, and I had like 15 or 16 auctions of all that stuff. It's kind of like my pension from the Ramones. Thank God I held on to all that stuff.
Yeah, and you didn't think about it then.
No, I just put it in a room, and it was sitting in a room, and all of a sudden it was the 40th anniversary, and the show came about. I put all my stuff in the museum show. It was terrific, and then it ended, and I got it back, and I was lucky enough to auction off a lot of that.
So how do you stay busy these days? What's your day-to-day life like?
Well, this pandemic, it was like put on hold. I was, before the pandemic, I was working at the Queen's Theater as an in-house manager. That was a nice little job. I'm waiting for them to come back. Theaters got to open up again like Broadway. We'll see if I'll get back into that. I've been trying to do little podcasts and interviews like you, and as I said, the stereo dinner thing on the 24th of June. And, just trying to keep busy. It's rough. It's rough.
I'd love to know what your favorite Ramones song is, album, and concert. Let's start with your favorite Ramones song and why.
This is very easy for me. People come up to me all the time and say, what's your favorite Ramones song? It's on the End of the Century album, and it's called All the Way. Because Joey wrote me into the song. Monte's driving me crazy. It's like being in the Navy.
That's
right.
right.
It's a Ramones song.
Yes. That's great.
So that has to be my favorite Ramones song.
Of course. Of course.
As far as albums go, I like a lot of different songs from different albums. I think the first Ramones album is a classic,
And finally, your favorite Ramones concert and why? The London one?
That's difficult because over the years, they played 2,263 shows.
That's a lot.
In there's a whole slew of great shows, I can't really pick out one. I guess the New Year's Eve show. It's 1977 probably because I was running sound for that, and it was just a classic Ramones show. I'll pick that one.
The book is available on Amazon, among other sites. It's gone through 2 or 3 revisions or editions, right? You've added some.
The last one is the bonus edition. It has a red Ramones lettering on it. You have to get that one because I added 40 more pages. Over the years, things happened with the Ramones. I kept on updating the book. So this is the last revision of the book, but it's the bonus edition. You got to look for that with the red Ramones lettering on the front.
Well, have you seen all the great reviews on Amazon? Everybody loves the book.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, they love it.
The book was written by myself and Frank Meyer. Initially, when I was first approached for the book, I said, I'm not really a writer. They said, we'll get you a ghostwriter. So they came up with a bunch of people, and one of them was Frank. And he's quite a great musician, a huge Ramones fan, a good journalist. He was everything I needed. So I just thought, okay, Frank, you can be my co-author. So I made him, instead of a ghostwriter, he became the co-author of the book. And just another thing, the cover of my book was done by the great John Holmstrom. Punk Magazine, John Holmstrom. You're not familiar with him?
Yep.
And I got him to do my cover of my book because initially, I said, what am I going to put on the cover? I mean, I worked with 8 different Ramones over the years. So I said, I'll come up with let's do a cartoon of me in the van with all 8 Ramones. And if you look at the cover of the book, we're driving off out of New York City, the Cbgb in the background, the pinheads back there, and things are flying off the van. And there's a little sign on the side of the road, there's 2,263 miles to go. You know what that means, right?
Yeah, that's one of the lyrics?
No.
What's
that's how many shows they played.
Oh, that's how many shows.
That's how many shows they played.
God.
263 shows, and I listed them all in the back of the book, every single show. So if you say I was in 1986, I saw the Ramones somewhere in January, you look down the list, and you can find it in my book there.
That's great. Where can people go if they want to reach out to you? Are you into the social media stuff, the Facebook? And
I'm on Facebook,
okay.
Monte A. Melnick, and Instagram, montea.melnick. I'm out there, Facebook, Instagram.
It's crazy to think these guys are gone because they really aren't. You listen to the music and they're there.
Well, I always say, this is kind of a joke I tell a million times. The Ramones are so big now that if they were this big when I was working for them, I would have gotten a big raise.
Be playing stadiums.
Now it's like they say the Ramones, Beatles, Stones in the same sentence. And then jock rock albums. You used to go to sports venues and people go, hey, let's go and chanting. They're not sports jock rock albums. So people in the baseball game were chanting, anywhere they were chanting, hey, let's go. That's amazing,
Oh, it is. And it's well deserved. Monte, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you.
Thanks to Monte A. Melnick for taking us through his book, On the Road with the Ramones. Be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock on Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find us online at bookedonrock.com, on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast, on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact us through the website. If you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email or contact me through the Booked on Rock website. I'm Eric Senich. Look forward to having you back again next time for another episode of Booked on Rock.